Hey, Legacy Church, it's good to be back together again with you this week. We are continuing our David series in our third week on David and his friendship with Jonathan. You know, one of the strangest things about our world is that it's never been easier to stay connected, and yet it's never been easier to feel alone. At any given time, if we want to get a hold of someone, we can text them, email them, call them, video call them, DM them, tweet them, message them, follow them. There's no shortage of ways to get connected with someone almost instantly, no matter where they are in the world. And if we're close enough with them, they can actually share their location with us and we can just watch them move around on the map. And all of this kind of happens instantly. We are literally more connected to each other than at any other point in human history. And yet, many of us still feel deeply unknown. Not because there aren't people around us or nobody knows our name, but because there's a difference between being connected and being known. There's a difference between having people who know what you're doing and having people who know how you're really doing. And you can have people all around you and still not have anyone who really has access to you, which can be a terribly lonely place to be when things aren't going well in your life. When you lose your job or you break up with the partner, when it rains, it's nice to have someone who can hold the umbrella over your head, right? Loneliness is about more than the hard times, though. Sometimes loneliness shows up when life is going well, when it's the best of times and not just the worst of times. You finally get the opportunity you've always wanted. You get the recognition you've always thought you've deserved. And you finally do the thing that everyone said couldn't be done. And people clap, right? But it still feels empty. Because applause isn't the same thing as friendship. Being celebrated isn't the same thing as being known. And I think that's where David is at in our story. See, for the last 2 weeks, we've been walking through the early life of David. And in week 1, we saw David in the field. He was overlooked by his father. He was passed over by his brothers. And he was forgotten in the place where nobody expected anything important to happen. And yet, God saw him. David was hidden from people, but he wasn't hidden from God. Then last week, we see David step out of the field and into the valley. Israel saw Goliath through fear, but David saw him through faith. David didn't win because he was bigger or stronger or more impressive. He won because the battle belonged to the Lord. One stone, one sling, one God. You remember that? But what's interesting is that after David defeats Goliath, his life doesn't suddenly become easier. In fact, in some ways, it actually gets more complicated, and it actually gets more dangerous. Because now David is visible. People know his name. People are singing songs to him. People are beginning to see that the hand of God is on his life, which seems like it would be a good thing, on the surface at least. But what he discovers is that it can also be a dangerous thing. Because while the people celebrate David, Saul begins to fear him. He becomes suspicious of his motives, and he starts to feel anxious about his ambition. And when that happens, Saul decides that he has to kill David. Can you imagine that? At the point when everything in your life seems to finally be coming together, when everything is going well and you've done nothing wrong, the very person who should be celebrating you turns on you. And what should have led to a coronation ends up leading to caves, conflict, and chaos. But before that happens, God gives him something that he's going to desperately need. Not a throne, not an army, but a friend, which I think is significant. Because oftentimes when we think of successful people, we think of strong, independent people who pull themselves up by their bootstraps and blaze a trail alone. But the truth is that that's almost never really the case. We all need friends, people who can be there to support us and walk alongside of us, people who come alongside of us to strengthen us and help us become better. And David is no different when you think about it, which is why when his future is being laid out before him, God doesn't give him more strength or better looks. He gives him a friend. So let's dive into our scripture for today and see what happens right after David speaks with Saul following the defeat of Goliath. In 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 4, the author writes this: After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword and his bow and his belt. Now, if we read this too quickly, we might miss how significant this moment really is. But just think about what's really happening here. Jonathan isn't some random soldier who meets David and thinks, I like this guy. Jonathan is Saul's son, the king's son. I mean, this guy is literally the crown prince of Israel. By every social and cultural norm, Jonathan is next in line for the throne, which means that by exalting David, Jonathan is expediting the loss of his own future. If David rises, Jonathan doesn't become king. And yet Jonathan doesn't respond to David with jealousy. He responds in love. He doesn't see David as a threat to his identity. He sees David as someone that God is clearly using, which is one of the first things that I think we can learn from Jonathan. And that's this: a godly friend can recognize the grace of God in your life without needing to compete with it, which sounds simple, but it's not easy. Because it's one thing to love someone when they're struggling, but it's another thing to love someone when they're advancing. Jonathan could have looked at David and thought, that should have been me, the attention, the future, the kingdom. But instead, Jonathan makes a covenant with David, which is actually a super significant moment, because in the ancient world, covenants carried a ton of weight. We don't use that word very often anymore, so the significance might be lost on us. But in the ancient world, a covenant was the most serious commitment that a person could make. This wasn't just a casual friendship. This was a serious commitment. Covenants involved promises and obligations and faithfulness over time. They weren't based on what you felt that day. They were based on a commitment that endured beyond the mood of the moment. And that's the kind of friendship that Jonathan offers David, a friendship with weight to it, a friendship with commitment to it. The text says that Jonathan loved David as himself. In other words, Jonathan's friendship isn't about using David or being close to David so he can benefit from his fame. Jonathan is genuinely committed to David's good. And in order to demonstrate that commitment, Jonathan does something significant. He gives his robe and tunic and sword and bow and belt to David. Do you see the significance of this? These aren't random gifts, right? These are royal and military symbols. Jonathan is essentially handing David the signs of his own status and saying, I recognize what God is doing in your life, and I promise not to fight against it. Which is a remarkable act of humility when you think about it, because Jonathan doesn't need to be the center of the story in order to be faithful in the story. And I think some of us might need to hear that this week, because one of the tests of spiritual maturity isn't just how we take care of people who are low, it's how we respond when God blesses someone else. Can we celebrate God's blessing in the life of another person? Can we recognize someone else's calling without needing to control it? Can we stand beside someone when their life seems to be moving forward while ours feels like it's standing still? That's what Jonathan does. And this is where Jonathan stands in sharp contrast to Saul. Saul sees David's rise as a threat, but Jonathan sees his rise as the work of God. And that's the difference between insecurity and humility. Insecurity convinces us that we need to protect our position. But humility frees us up to enjoy what God is doing in our lives and in the lives of our friends. And the truth is, we all need people like Jonathan in our lives, people who aren't just impressed with us, but who are committed to us, people who care about our soul and care about our character, people who care about whether we're becoming the person who God has called us to be. Because there's a kind of loneliness that a crowd can't fix, isn't there? You can have people who cheer for you. You can have people who laugh with you and still not have anyone who's helping to strengthen your soul. So the question really goes beyond, do I have people in my life who like me? And the real question is, do I have anyone who helps me stay faithful to God? And that's what Jonathan becomes for David. And David is going to need it. Because very quickly after he defeats Goliath, Saul's heart begins to turn. In 1 Samuel 18, after David defeats Goliath, the women of Israel come out singing. They sing that Saul has slain thousands, but David, he's slain tens of thousands. And from that moment on, Saul begins to watch David with suspicion. That little song kind of gets under his skin and it gnaws at his insecurity. He's already been rejected as king. He's already knows that the kingdom is slipping from his hands. And now here comes David, young, brave, and anointed. And instead of seeing David as a gift to Israel, Saul sees him as a threat to himself. And that's what insecurity does, doesn't it? It takes what God is doing in someone else's life and it interprets it as an attack on you. Saul can't rejoice in David's victory because Saul is too busy protecting Saul's image. And as the story continues, we come to see that this insecurity becomes more and more dangerous. See, at first, Saul's suspicions start out as fear, but eventually they become violent. And David finds himself in an incredibly painful position. He hasn't betrayed Saul. He hasn't tried to take the throne. He hasn't launched a rebellion. But David is suffering because of someone else's fears, which I think is important for us to recognize. Sometimes we suffer because we made a foolish decision, but sometimes we suffer because someone else has allowed insecurity or jealousy or fear to take over their hearts. David isn't perfect, but at this point in the story, he has been faithful, and yet faithfulness doesn't protect him from pain. It doesn't protect him from being misunderstood or targeted or being forced into a season that he never asked for. And that's exactly why Jonathan's friendship matters, because David needs someone close to Saul who can tell him the truth. So by the time that we get to 1 Samuel 20, David knows that something is wrong. Saul has already tried to kill him more than once. And so David goes to Jonathan and essentially asks him this: "What have I done? What is my crime? Why is your father trying to take my life?" Which surprises Jonathan. At first, he can't believe it, not because he thinks David is lying, but because Saul's his father. He wouldn't do that, right? Right? Unfortunately, he soon discovers that everything that David is saying is in fact true. And because of that, Jonathan's going to have to choose between faithfulness and family pressure. And that's not easy. So what do? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 20, David and Jonathan work out a plan. David is expected at the king's table for the new moon feast, which was an important monthly celebration in Israel's life. It was tied to the beginning of the lunar month, and it involved things like sacrifice and eating and being present with the king's household, which basically means that David's absence would be noticed. Now, while the party is happening, David said that he's going to hide in the field. And if Saul responds peacefully to his absence, then David would be safe. But if Saul becomes angry, Jonathan will know that Saul is determined to harm him, and David will run. And so Jonathan agrees to find out the truth and communicate it to David, which is exactly what happens next. When David's seat is empty at the festival, Saul notices. And at first, Saul says nothing. But on the second day, he asks Jonathan why David hasn't come to the meal. And in response, Jonathan tells his dad the story that he and David had cooked up. And Saul explodes. His anger is not only directed at David, it turns on Jonathan too. Saul insults Jonathan, he shames him, and he basically tells him that as long as David is alive, Jonathan will never be king. Which I think actually reveals a lot about the difference in values between Saul and his son. Saul is obsessed with keeping the kingdom, with preserving his power and his image. But Jonathan is surrendered to what God is doing in his life and the life of his friends. Saul says, protect your future, but Jonathan says, honor the covenant. But then Saul does something shocking. In verse 32, the author writes, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. I mean, the guy hurls a spear at him, right? His own son. And in that moment, Jonathan knows that David was right, that Saul really does intend to kill him. And so Jonathan leaves the table angry and grieved. What has his father done? He isn't stirring up drama. He isn't being reckless, but he refuses to pretend that this wrong is right, which is such a great quality in a good friend, isn't it? Friends who tell us the truth regardless of the cost, because isolation can make us feel vulnerable. When we're isolated, our fears get louder, and when we're isolated, our perspective often gets smaller. And that's why we need people who can help us see clearly, people who can say, you're not crazy. That really is happening the way you see it. Or sometimes people can say, I love you, but you're not seeing this clearly at all. That the way you're perceiving the situation isn't how the rest of us are seeing it. Both are gifts, because a true friend doesn't just tell you what you want to hear. A true friend helps you discern what's true and what's not. And this is one of the most important things that Jonathan does for David. He helps David face reality. He doesn't minimize the danger. He doesn't spiritualize the pain. He doesn't say, well, I'm sure Saul means well. I'm sure my dad doesn't mean it like that. No, right? Once Jonathan sees the truth, he acts. After his father hurls the spear at his head, he goes out into the field where David is hiding, and using the signal that they had arranged, he lets David know that it's not safe to return. And when that happens, David's life is about to change forever. It's about to be turned on its head. It's never going back to normal. And so Jonathan sends the boy away, and David comes out from his hiding place. And in one of the most tender and moving moments in the life of David, David bows before Jonathan 3 times, and they share a brotherly kiss, and they weep together. They know that this might be the last time that they see each other. And they also know that the price that Jonathan has paid to ensure his safety. I mean, this isn't a small goodbye. This is the moment that David realizes that his life as he knew it was over. He's no longer simply the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. He's no longer simply the warrior who defeated Goliath. He's now a fugitive, and he's going to be on the run. Can you imagine how that must have felt to have your life torn apart over something that you didn't even do, over something that you weren't even guilty of? So what does Jonathan do next? Well, he sends David away in peace, and he reminds him of the covenant that they made before the Lord. In other words, he wants to make sure that David knows that although their lives were changing, their deep covenant friendship was still intact. It was lived before God. Jonathan couldn't go with David into every cave. He couldn't protect him from every danger. He couldn't make the road easy, but he could remind David that their covenant still stands before the Lord. And sometimes that's all you need, right? The reminder that someone's still in your corner, that someone still has your back. It doesn't fix everything, but it does help you to take the next step in faith. And I think that helps us understand why Jonathan's friendship with David seems to matter so much. See, before David ever goes into hiding, God gives him a friend in the field. Before David faces the loneliness of exile, God gives him the loyalty of Jonathan. And that's one of the best ways that God cares for his people. He doesn't always remove us from the wilderness, but sometimes he gives us someone who helps us keep trusting him while we're walking towards it. That doesn't mean that Jonathan becomes David's savior. He doesn't. Jonathan is a gift, but he isn't God. And that's important because even the best human friendships have limits. Jonathan can warn David. He can encourage David. Jonathan can even stand with David at great personal cost, but Jonathan can't ultimately save David, which I think is a great lesson for those of us who have the tendency to idolize our friendships. See, friends are a gift from God, but they can never be a replacement for God. At the same time, we also shouldn't make the opposite mistake and act like we don't need these friendships. Some of us have spiritualized our isolation. We say things like, don't worry, it's just between God and I. Or I just rely on God. I don't worry about other people. And of course, we should rely on God. But sometimes the God that you rely on is trying to help you through the difficult things of life with people alongside of you. See, God made us for relationships from the very beginning. Before sin even entered the world, God says it wasn't good for the man to be alone, which means that aloneness was a problem even before brokenness entered the picture. We were created for community with God and community with others. So if David needed Jonathan, then maybe we do too. So what can we actually learn from this story? How can we apply it to our lives? Well, first, we need to recognize the danger of isolation. Isolation isn't just emotionally painful, it's spiritually dangerous. Because when you're isolated, there's nobody to challenge the stories that you're telling yourself. There's nobody to ask the follow-up questions. There's nobody to notice when your heart is beginning to drift. And for some of us, isolation doesn't look like sitting alone in a dark room. For some of us, it might look like being busy. It looks like being around people all the time, but never actually letting anyone get close enough to know the truth. You can serve in the church and still be isolated. You can lead a group and still be isolated, because isolation isn't about whether people are near you. It's about whether anyone truly knows you. Second, we need to identify our Jonathan. Who in your life has permission to actually speak truth into your life? Who knows where you're tempted? Who knows what discourages you? Who can tell you when you're acting strong instead of actually being strong? And if you don't have someone like that, the point isn't to leave this message feeling ashamed. The point is to start taking steps towards putting someone like that in your life. Pray for that kind of friendship. Pursue that kind of friendship. Be willing to move past surface level conversation, because covenant friendships rarely happen by accident. They almost always require honesty and time and consistency and courage. And so make time for that, because it's important for not only your spiritual life, but the person next to you as well. Thirdly, we need to become a Jonathan for someone else. This sermon isn't just about asking who will be that friend for me. It's asking, who is God calling me to stand beside myself? Who needs encouragement? Who needs protection? Who needs someone to help them find strength in God? Because Jonathan isn't remembered because he's protecting his own platform. He's remembered because he loved David more than himself. You know, the truth is, David was anointed by God. He defeated Goliath, and yet he still needed Jonathan. So maybe strength isn't about pretending that you don't actually need anyone. Maybe strength is about being honest enough to let the right people into your life. Some of us have been living with too much distance. We have people who know the version of us that shows up on a Sunday morning, but not the version that shows up and struggles on Monday morning. We have people who know our opinions, but not our wounds. And God may be inviting us to take a step towards that model of covenant friendship. Not with everyone, not without wisdom, but with someone. Because isolation is a major spiritual liability. And friendship is one of the gifts that God uses to keep us faithful. So pray about it this week. Look for that friend. Think about who in your life might play that role. And if you haven't found someone like that, continue to get more and more involved at Legacy Church. Meet new people, because I promise there's somebody out there that's ready to be a Jonathan to you, and maybe somebody out there who needs you to be a Jonathan to them. Amen? All right. Thanks, Legacy Church. We'll see you next week. God bless you.